Angela Carter thought it would be just another ordinary flight, one she had saved for months to take her son David on a long-awaited vacation. But as they settled into their seats, the atmosphere shifted. A flight attendant, sharp-eyed and cold, began singling them out, enforcing rules that didn't seem to apply to anyone else. What started as small, quiet humiliations escalated until a silent witness, a first-class passenger named Marcus Reed, decided enough was enough. What happened next would shake the entire plane, leaving passengers whispering and one flight attendant facing consequences she never saw coming. Stay with me, this is a story about courage in the face of quiet injustice, and the ripple effect that can start with just one voice. Before we dive into the full story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories that matter. The hum of the engines was a soft, distant murmur, like the low-pitched roll of thunder before a storm finds its voice. The cabin swayed gently under the weight of bodies finding their places, luggage stowed, elbows negotiated over armrests, heads bowed against the artificial glow of overhead lights. It was a familiar ritual, ordinary in every sense. David sat upright in his seat, his small fingers tapping lightly against the window. His eyes, wide and unburdened by years, danced with reflections of the tarmac and runway lights. Angela, his mother, watched him with quiet amusement, though her shoulders carried the weight of long days behind her. She smoothed down the hem of her blouse and exhaled softly. This trip, brief as it was, meant something to her. A gift, not extravagant but hard-earned. It's so high up, David whispered, his voice dipping in reverence, as if he feared speaking too loudly might disturb the clouds they were yet to reach. It'll be even higher soon, Angela replied, tucking a stray curl behind his ear. Her hand lingered for a moment, savoring the rare stillness of time spent together. Passengers continued their shuffle down the aisle. A man coughed loudly. The overhead compartments groaned open and shut. Near the front of the plane, a woman in a navy blue uniform moved briskly. Her hair was pulled back into a bun so tight it seemed to tug at her expression, making every glance appear like disapproval. Every step measured and brisk. Angela watched the woman, Veronica, according to the silver name tag pinned neatly above her breast pocket. There was something in her walk, something in the way she skimmed the passengers with sharp, practiced eyes, as if she had already judged and catalogued every one of them by the time they sat down. Veronica paused 2 rows ahead, adjusting a man's bag with a polite but clipped tone. Angela thought little of it at first. After all, this wasn't her first flight. She knew the type: efficient, professional, a little cold perhaps, but harmless. David shifted, leaning just slightly into the aisle, trying to catch a better glimpse of the plane's cockpit in the far distance. It was a small thing, a child's curiosity, but Veronica's eyes caught him like a snare. "Sit back properly," she said, not unkind, but loud enough for the nearby rows to hear. The words were a stone dropped into calm water, ripples spreading outward. David recoiled instantly, his excitement draining into something more guarded. Angela straightened in her seat. "He's just excited," she said, forcing softness into her voice. "It's his first time flying." Veronica's gaze flicked to Angela, and in that moment, there was a shift, an almost imperceptible tightening of her features, a stiffness that Angela had learned to recognize long ago. "This isn't a playground," Veronica replied, her voice losing its earlier warmth. "Rules are there for a reason." Angela's jaw tightened. She glanced at David, who was now staring down at his lap, his small fingers worrying at the edges of his drawing pad. "Of course," Angela said, her voice measured. "It won't happen again." But as Veronica turned, Angela caught at the slight shake of the head, the pursed lips, the way she muttered something under her breath, low and inaudible. But Angela knew. She knew. The air in the cabin shifted, subtle but palpable. A murmur swept across the rows, passengers stealing glances in their direction. Angela's chest tightened, but she pressed her hand against David's back, steadying herself through him. "It's okay," she whispered, leaning down so only he could hear. "You didn't do anything wrong." David nodded, but his shoulders slumped, and the glow that had danced in his eyes minutes before had all but dimmed. From the first-class section, Marcus Reed watched. He hadn't meant to, but when Veronica's voice cut across the cabin, it had drawn his attention. Like an alarm he'd trained himself to recognize. Marcus had spent years in boardrooms and executive meetings, years listening to polished words that hid barbs beneath pleasantries. He recognized what he saw now, just as he had recognized it in the halls of his office. In negotiations, in glances exchanged across tables that told him, in no uncertain terms, that some places welcomed him with reservation. Marcus Reed leaned back in his seat, but his eyes did not waver from Angela and her son. It would have been easy to let it go. Angela had spent most of her life letting small slights pass, smoothing over the tension with polite smiles and lowered eyes. But this was not just her experience, it was David's. And that, she realized, was something she could not simply tuck away. The hum of the engines faded. The aisle had grown quiet, but not peaceful. There was a weight to the silence that followed, like the room itself held its breath, waiting for the next move. And somewhere deep in Angela's chest, something long dormant stirred. At first, there was stillness, one of those uneasy moments that linger just long enough to make you wonder if you imagined the sharpness of the words. Angela adjusted the fold of her blouse, smoothed David's hair, and willed herself to let it pass. But the weight of Veronica's voice clung to her like humidity in the dead of summer, thick and suffocating. David, unaware of the complexity unraveling around him, returned to his sketchbook, his brow furrowed with the intensity only children seem to have when the world around them suddenly feels too large. Angela watched his small hand move in neat lines across the page, his crayon capturing the wing of the plane beyond the window. She exhaled, steadying herself. "Can I have some water, Mama?" David asked, eyes not lifting from his drawing. "Of course, baby," she replied, pressing the call button above her seat. It was a small thing. She could have retrieved the water herself. But part of her needed to see Veronica again, if only to reclaim some sense of ease. The minutes stretched. The light above her head glowed. But no one came. Angela's hand lingered over the button, her thumb itching to press it again. But just as she lifted her arm, Veronica appeared, her gait deliberate and unhurried, as though she had been watching the request and letting it simmer. "Yes?" Veronica's tone didn't carry the warmth of hospitality. It was clipped, the shape of politeness with none of its substance. Angela met her gaze and held it. "Could I have some water for my son?" Veronica's eyes flickered to David. There was the faintest hesitation, a wrinkle in her expression, so brief it might have passed unnoticed by anyone else. But Angela caught it. "Of course," Veronica replied after a pause, her smile thin and tight, like a bow pulled too far. She returned moments later with a cup of water, placing it on the tray with the delicate care reserved for objects she feared might break if she held them too long. "Let me know if you need anything else," Veronica said, her words laced with an undercurrent that Angela couldn't quite name but recognized all the same. Angela nodded, murmuring a quiet thank you. But as Veronica turned, her words echoed louder than they should have in Angela's mind anything else. It wasn't the phrase itself. It was how it was said. The way Veronica's eyes lingered too long on David's dark curls. How her hand brushed against the back of a seat in front of them. Her fingers tightening ever so slightly, as if suppressing the need to do more. Angela was not one to imagine ghosts. She had been here before. On buses, in restaurants, in schools where David's presence drew that same flicker of something unspoken from strangers. Across the aisle, an older woman glanced their way, her eyes soft with quiet sympathy. Angela hated that look more than anything. It was the look of someone who saw everything but would do nothing. Marcus Reed watched it all unfold. From his seat in first class, the exchange played out in his periphery. His hands rested lightly on the tablet in his lap, but his eyes stayed fixed on the narrow space between seats. He recognized it, the slow unraveling of what some might dismiss as nothing more than a misunderstanding. But Marcus had lived too long in a world that taught him how quickly misunderstandings could escalate. How easily they could harden into something irreversible. It was never the moment itself. It was the moments that followed. And something about the tension in the air told him this wasn't over. As the plane taxied onto the runway, Angela leaned toward David, kissing his forehead. "You doing okay?" she asked softly. David nodded but didn't speak. Angela followed his gaze to Veronica, who now stood at the front of the cabin, demonstrating the safety procedures with robotic precision. The set of her shoulders was rigid, the flick of her wrist as she secured the seatbelt too sharp. Angela shifted uncomfortably, a slow burn rising in her chest. This was not about the water. It never was. The flight climbed, but the tension followed. Halfway into the journey, Veronica passed through the aisles, checking overhead compartments. As she reached Angela's row, David tugged lightly at his mother's sleeve. "Mama," he whispered, eyes wide, "I forgot my toy car in my backpack." Angela smiled. "It's okay, baby. We'll get it when we land." Veronica's gaze flicked toward them again. "I can get it for him," Angela said casually, reaching down toward the bag beneath her seat. Veronica's hand appeared, stopping her with an unexpected swiftness. "Please keep your bag stowed," Veronica said sharply. "Passengers are not allowed to reach under their seats during flight." Angela paused, blinking as the warmth in her chest twisted into something colder. "I was just getting his toy," Angela replied, her tone even but pointed. Veronica's face hardened, lips pressing into a thin line. "It's the policy," Veronica repeated, louder this time. "Let's not make this difficult." Angela's fingers tightened around the strap of the bag, her knuckles white. The cabin around her felt smaller, the murmurs of nearby passengers swelling just beneath the surface. Marcus Reed placed his tablet aside. This was the moment. "Excuse me," Marcus's voice carried, calm but deliberate, as he rose from his seat. The entire cabin seemed to still. He approached with a measured step, stopping just short of Angela's row. His gaze settled on Veronica, soft but unwavering. "Is there an issue?" Marcus asked, his voice polite but edged with the quiet authority of someone who expected an answer. Angela exhaled silently, her eyes meeting Marcus's briefly. And in that shared glance, there was something else: recognition. Veronica shifted uncomfortably, her professionalism unraveling at the seams. "No issue," Veronica said hastily, her eyes flitting toward Marcus. Then back to Angela. "It's just policy." Marcus smiled faintly, but the warmth didn't reach his eyes. "Then I trust we can apply the policy with the same grace to every passenger." "Yes?" Veronica's lips parted as if to argue, but no words came. Angela watched, her pulse steadying as Veronica retreated down the aisle, her steps quicker than before. David tugged at his mother's sleeve once more, his small voice barely a whisper. "Who is that man?" Angela glanced toward Marcus, who had returned to his seat, but not before offering her a subtle nod. "Someone paying attention," she replied. The hum of the engines filled the cabin like a distant drumbeat. Steady and relentless. Outside the window, the sky stretched endless and indifferent, painted in soft hues of blue that should have been calming. But inside, Angela felt the atmosphere shift, the air thickening around her as if the walls of the plane had quietly drawn closer. David rested his head against her arm, his fingers moving lazily over his sketchpad. Each line he traced seemed to Angela like a quiet defiance, his crayon carving space for himself in a world that so often tried to shrink him. Veronica had not passed their row since the last exchange. Angela could feel the space she left. But absence carries weight, too, and this absence, this careful avoidance, felt deliberate, like a door closing just as she approached it. But doors left closed too long have a way of creaking open when you least expect them. A few rows up, Marcus Reed observed everything in silence, his eyes flicking occasionally from the book in his lap to the narrow aisle ahead. He wasn't the kind of man to meddle without reason. Years in his position had taught him that patience was a weapon as sharp as any word. But he had also learned something else: silence, if left to fester, can twist into complicity. And complicity was not a weight he intended to carry. Angela felt the plane shift slightly as it began to cruise, leveling off at 30,000 feet. She glanced down at David, hoping the altitude would bring a sense of stillness with it. "Would you like something to drink?" Rachel, the younger flight attendant with the easy smile, appeared beside them, her tone warm, her eyes soft. David's head lifted slightly. "Orange juice, please." Rachel grinned. "I think we can manage that." Angela exhaled, grateful for the reprieve. But just as Rachel turned toward the galley, Veronica reappeared at the far end of the aisle. Her eyes cut through the cabin with surgical precision. And though she didn't look directly at Angela, her presence pressed against them like an unwelcome shadow. Angela straightened, adjusting her seatbelt. Marcus saw it too. Rachel returned moments later with a small carton of juice, bending to meet David's eye level. "Here you go, sweetheart." David grinned, accepting the drink with both hands. Angela mouthed a quiet thank you to Rachel. But as Rachel stepped away, Veronica's voice, quiet but sharp, cut through the space between them. Rachel. Rachel's head turned. You can't serve that row right now, Veronica said, her eyes finally settling on Angela. Rachel's brow furrowed. I'll take it from here, Veronica added, her voice soft but edged with something unyielding. Rachel hesitated for just a moment, then nodded, stepping aside. Angela's pulse quickened. Is there a problem? Marcus's voice carried again, this time louder. From first class. His chair creaked softly as he shifted, rising slowly to his feet. Veronica's posture stiffened. No problem, sir. But there was a problem. Angela could feel it. David could feel it. The passengers seated nearby, heads down, pretending not to hear, could feel it. Veronica bent slightly at the waist, speaking low but firm. I'm just making sure protocols are followed. Angela's eyes narrowed. Ma'am, she began, her voice calm but deliberate. I appreciate your concern, but I don't think orange juice violates any protocols. The quiet in the cabin seemed to sharpen. It's about consistency, Veronica replied, straightening. Angela set her hands gently on David's shoulders. Consistency, she repeated, more to herself than anyone else. Marcus had taken several steps forward, moving slowly down the aisle. He stopped just a row away from Angela's seat. Veronica, he said plainly, folding his arms, I think the lady and her son can enjoy their drink without further explanation. Angela met Marcus's eyes, a silent exchange passing between them. Veronica hesitated, her hand still resting against the back of the seat. Angela saw it clearly, the battle playing out just beneath Veronica's expression. A choice, hanging in the air. But some choices are not made in a single moment. They are layered, built from years of glances, assumptions, and quiet indignities that go unanswered. Veronica stepped back. The tension in the cabin did not break. It stretched, pulling at the edges of the space around them. Angela turned to David, brushing a curl from his forehead. Drink your juice, baby. David nodded, but his eyes darted warily toward Veronica's retreating figure. Marcus did not return to his seat immediately. He stood, lingering near Angela's row as if anchoring her in place by proximity alone. And though Veronica disappeared into the galley, her presence lingered like static in the air. Angela's hands trembled faintly, but she steadied them against David's back. She had learned, long ago, how to hold her ground without raising her voice. And she wasn't about to forget that now. From first class, Marcus watched quietly. He had seen too many storms like this before. But this time, he had no intention of letting it pass unnoticed. The cabin had returned to its rhythm, the mechanical drone of engines settling over the passengers like a heavy quilt. But there are some silences that do not soothe, they gather weight, thickening with each passing minute until the smallest sound becomes a thunderclap. Angela shifted in her seat, trying to focus on David's quiet hum as he sketched. His small, careful strokes should have been enough to ease her mind, but every so often, her eyes flicked toward the galley where Veronica had disappeared. There's something in the way a person can vanish while still holding space in the room. Veronica was out of sight, but not gone. Angela could feel it the way you feel a storm long before the first drop of rain. Marcus Reed lingered at the edge of first class, one hand resting lightly against the seat in front of him. He hadn't returned to his tablet. His attention stayed anchored to the row where Angela sat. He was waiting, and so was Angela. But storms do not wait forever. It happened in increments, small acts that might have been dismissed if they stood alone. The beverage cart rolled by, stopping just short of their row. David's eyes brightened, expecting the same soft smile Rachel had offered earlier. But this time, the cart stopped with a sudden jolt. Anything for you? Veronica's voice hovered above Angela's shoulder. Angela's lips tightened. No, thank you, she replied evenly. She could feel Veronica's gaze drift downward, lingering just a second too long on David's half-empty cup of juice. Everything all right here? Marcus's voice cut through the quiet. Veronica straightened, but Angela caught the flicker of annoyance in her eyes the way a cornered animal reveals its teeth. If only for a breath. Yes, sir, Veronica replied, her tone clipped. Marcus didn't move. Good. But nothing about the space felt good. Angela could feel the way Veronica's presence bristled against her skin, like the scrape of rough fabric against an open wound. David, sensing the tension he couldn't quite name, tugged lightly on Angela's sleeve. "Mama," he whispered, his voice barely loud enough to rise above the hum of the engines. "Can I draw the mountains when we land?" Angela smiled softly, brushing a hand against his cheek. "Of course, baby." But just as she spoke, Veronica's voice returned, low but unmistakable. "Please make sure your son stays in his seatbelt for the duration of the flight." Angela's head lifted sharply. He was seated. He had not moved, and they both knew it. Angela turned, her eyes locking with Veronica's. For the first time, she did not temper the force behind her gaze. "There's no issue with his seatbelt," Angela said, her voice soft but firm. Veronica's eyes narrowed, and for a fleeting second, the tension crystallized into something far more dangerous, a confrontation not yet spoken but simmering beneath the surface. Marcus stepped forward. "That's enough," he said. His tone did not rise, but it carried weight like steel wrapped in silk. Veronica hesitated, her jaw tightening. She shifted, just enough to acknowledge him without losing the false grip of authority she held. Angela could see it clearly now, the quiet war waged behind Veronica's eyes. But Marcus did not waver. "This is not about seatbelts," he added, his voice measured. "It's about how you choose to enforce the rules." The nearby passengers stirred, heads lifting just slightly, their attention pulled toward the thin crack of light opening before them. Veronica opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught, suspended in her throat. Angela's pulse quickened, though her face remained still. She had lived this moment before, more times than she could count. And yet, it never grew easier. Marcus leaned in just slightly, his voice dipping low enough that only Veronica could hear. "I've been watching," he said, "and so has everyone else." Veronica's lips parted, as if to argue, but the weight of his words pinned her in place. Slowly, she stepped back, her eyes flicking toward the galley before she retreated down the aisle. Angela exhaled softly, running her hand over David's curls. Marcus stood a moment longer, ensuring Veronica did not return before turning to Angela with a small nod. "Thank you," she said quietly. Marcus met her gaze with something Angela recognized, a look that said he understood more than he let on. "It's not over," Marcus replied gently, just loud enough for Angela to hear. And he was right, because some storms do not break, they gather strength, waiting for the right moment to return. Angela had thought that once Veronica stepped away, the tension might dissolve, that the quiet would return to something resembling peace. But silence, when stretched too thin, has a way of snapping. David had gone back to his sketching, the orange juice forgotten at his side. His crayon moved across the paper in broad, confident strokes, but Angela could see the slight tremble in his hand, the unspoken way children absorb what adults try to shield them from. Angela tried to match his ease, leaning back into her seat, but her mind would not rest. Every so often, she felt the eyes of other passengers flicker toward her, quickly darting away when she met their gaze. Marcus Reed had returned to his seat, though he had not resumed reading. His body faced forward, but his eyes remained vigilant, trained on the galley where Veronica had disappeared. Angela wondered how many times Marcus had found himself in this position, waiting for a confrontation he did not start but could not ignore. The hum of the engines deepened as the plane settled into its cruising altitude. The air around them, however, remained thin, and then it happened. Veronica returned. She did not approach immediately. Instead, she lingered by the galley, speaking to Rachel in hushed tones. Rachel's eyes darted quickly toward Angela's row, concern knitting her brows. Angela couldn't hear the words, but the rhythm of the conversation was clear. Rachel's discomfort, Veronica's insistence. Angela's chest tightened. She didn't need to hear the words. She knew what was being said. This is how it happens. Small moments, pieced together, until the weight becomes unbearable. Angela watched as Rachel nodded hesitantly, then turned back toward the aisle, leaving Veronica standing alone. Marcus shifted in his seat, and for a brief moment, his eyes met Angela's across the rows. He was watching, and so was everyone else. Angela glanced down at David, who had tucked his knees up, curling into the seat. She placed her hand gently over his, feeling the soft rise and fall of his breath. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, but she didn't know if that was true. Veronica began moving down the aisle again, slower this time, as if calculating each step. Her eyes swept over the cabin, but it was clear where they would land. As she approached, Marcus's voice broke the stillness. "Veronica," he said, not loud, but enough to stop her in her tracks. She turned, her face carefully composed. "Yes, Mr. Reed?" Marcus rose to his feet, moving with the kind of quiet authority that filled the space more than volume ever could. "Why are we still doing this?" Marcus asked, his voice low but sharp. Veronica's back straightened. "Excuse me?" Marcus took a step closer, speaking just loud enough for the nearest rows to hear. "You've walked by this road 3 times now. Each time, it's been under the pretense of enforcing protocol. I'd like to know which protocol exactly you believe hasn't been followed." Angela's heart pounded beneath her ribs. But she remained silent. David's small hand curled into hers, and she squeezed it gently, reassuring him even as her own certainty wavered. Veronica's gaze flicked toward Angela, and then back to Marcus. "There's no issue, sir," Veronica replied stiffly. Marcus's head tilted slightly. "Then I trust you can leave them to enjoy the rest of their flight." Veronica's mouth opened, but whatever words had formed, she swallowed them. Angela could see it, the tightening of Veronica's hands at her sides. The thin line of frustration pressed between her lips. And just like that, Veronica stepped back, offering a tight nod before turning sharply toward the front of the plane. Marcus remained standing for a beat longer, as if waiting for something more. When nothing came, he exhaled softly and returned to his seat. The cabin's hush deepened, the undercurrent of tension slowly beginning to recede. Angela felt her pulse steady, though she did not release David's hand. "Who is that man?" David whispered, barely lifting his head. Angela smiled faintly, brushing her fingers through his hair. "Someone who knows when to speak up," she replied, her voice softer now. David blinked, then looked over at Marcus, who had resumed his seat. Angela didn't know whether to feel grateful or tired. Perhaps both. But even as the flight settled into uneasy calm, she knew the storm had only passed for now. It would return, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday, because that's how it always happened. And yet, for the first time in a long while, Angela allowed herself to believe that when it did, someone else might be watching. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane soared further into the sky. But there was no dimming of the heat pressing against Angela's chest. David had fallen asleep, his head resting on her arm, the sketchpad slipping from his lap. His small breaths were soft, steady, but Angela felt none of his ease. She sat upright, eyes forward, though her mind raced. Marcus Reed had returned to his seat, but she could feel his awareness lingering, hovering just as hers did. His presence, a quiet but unwavering signal, had kept the situation from spilling over. For now, Angela had learned long ago that the "for now" was where danger lived. She'd grown accustomed to it, the simmer that precedes the boil. And though Marcus's intervention had tempered the flame, she knew embers could smolder beneath the surface for hours, waiting for the right gust of wind to reignite. Across the aisle, the other passengers shifted. Some buried their faces in magazines or behind the glow of tablets. But their eyes betrayed them. Angela caught the fleeting glances, the stiff postures. She knew the look, discomfort that hoped to remain uninvolved. A woman in a crisp blazer, sitting diagonally in front of Angela, offered her a brief, tight-lipped smile. Sympathy. Angela returned it politely, though she didn't ask for it. Sympathy was not a balm, it was a bandage applied too late. What Angela wanted, what she had always wanted, was not sympathy but space to exist without being seen as a disruption. The plane hummed on, and then Veronica returned. Angela sensed it before she saw her. The sound of Veronica's steps, slow and deliberate, punctuated the quiet. Marcus stirred slightly in his seat, his head lifting just enough to acknowledge her presence without turning. Angela braced herself, but this time, Veronica did not stop at Angela's row. She moved past it, walking toward the back of the cabin. Angela exhaled, though the knot in her chest did not loosen. Moments passed, and then, "Excuse me." Angela looked up, startled by the voice at her side. Rachel had appeared again, her demeanor softer than before, but the lines of unease had etched themselves into the corners of her eyes. "Would you mind coming with me for a moment?" Rachel asked, her tone quiet but strained. Angela's heart sank. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with steel. "No, ma'am," Rachel replied, though the flicker of hesitation in her eyes told another story. The captain would just like to speak with you privately. Angela's grip on David tightened instinctively. He's sleeping, she said, her eyes darting to her son. Rachel offered a small, apologetic smile. It won't take long. I can stay here and keep an eye on him. Angela hesitated. She looked at Marcus, who now watched them intently, eyes narrowing as if to assess the weight of the moment. Angela felt her pulse quicken. This wasn't about seatbelts, juice, or protocol anymore. It was about something else entirely. Marcus's gaze met Angela's, and though neither of them spoke, the message was clear: don't go alone. Angela carefully slid David's head onto the folded sweater at her side, brushing his hair gently as she rose from her seat. I'll be right back, baby, she whispered. David stirred slightly but did not wake. Angela followed Rachel down the narrow aisle, aware of the way passengers watched as she passed. Eyes always follow you when the world decides you are the problem. Rachel led her to the front of the plane, where Veronica stood near the cockpit door, arms crossed, her eyes sharp and unforgiving. Angela's chest tightened, but she kept her expression even. The captain's voice called from inside the cockpit. Come in, please. Angela stepped forward. The door clicked shut behind her. Inside the small space, the captain sat with his hands loosely folded in front of him. His face was calm but guarded, his blue eyes flickering between Angela and Veronica, who now stood at his side like a shadow. Ms. Carter, the captain began, his tone professional. I wanted to address a concern brought to my attention by one of the flight attendants. Angela's spine stiffened. Veronica, was it? Angela said, not bothering to hide the cold edge in her voice. The captain's lips pressed into a thin line. There seems to have been some tension during the flight. He continued, his words careful, measured. We want to ensure all our passengers feel safe and respected. Angela's eyes narrowed. And what, exactly, made Veronica feel unsafe? She asked plainly. The room seemed to shrink. Veronica shifted, but the captain spoke first. No one is accusing you of anything, Ms. Carter, he said, though the slight furrow of his brow betrayed him. We just want to avoid escalation. Angela let the words hang between them, dissecting them piece by piece. I see, she said after a long pause. Her voice dipped lower, calm but crackling beneath the surface. I have been in my seat the entire flight. I have done nothing but ask for water for my son and retrieve a toy from my bag. If that is what qualifies as escalation, I would suggest you reconsider who is being disruptive. Veronica's face reddened, her mouth opening to speak, but Angela cut her off with a look. The captain shifted uncomfortably. Marcus's voice echoed in Angela's memory. It's not over. And it wasn't. Angela leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with the captain. I would like to return to my seat now, she said quietly. The captain hesitated for just a moment, but then nodded. Of course. Angela turned, pushing past Veronica without a word. As she walked back to her seat, Marcus met her at the edge of first class. Angela did not stop, but she spoke just loud enough for him to hear. You were right, she said softly. Marcus's gaze followed her, his face unreadable. Angela settled back beside David, brushing his curls once more. But the fire beneath her ribs still burned. And for the first time, she had no interest in putting it out. Angela's steps were light as she returned to her seat. But inside, every nerve in her body felt electrified, as if she were walking along the edge of a blade. David's soft breathing was the only thing tethering her to calm. She eased down beside him, careful not to stir him from the fragile peace that sleep offered. The cabin hummed with the soft murmur of conversation and the distant clinking of trays in the galley. From the outside, it appeared ordinary, a flight like any other. But Angela knew better. And so did Marcus Reed. His gaze met hers the moment she settled back into her seat. He had not spoken since she passed. But his eyes, steady, unwavering, had followed every step she'd taken. Angela exhaled slowly, smoothing her hand over David's curls. But her hands trembled faintly, betraying the rage that simmered just beneath the surface. Veronica had returned to the front of the plane, her posture tense, her face flushed with the frustration of having been challenged and, perhaps worse, ignored. But there are things more dangerous than frustration. Pride wounded and silence can fester. Marcus shifted in his seat, leaning toward the aisle as if preparing to speak. But Angela caught his eye and shook her head softly. Not yet. There is a delicate art to managing moments like this, knowing when to press forward and when to let the weight of inaction speak louder than any words could. Angela had learned to wait. She had learned patience not out of virtue but necessity. But patience was not forgiveness. David stirred beside her, his small hand reaching instinctively for hers even as his eyes remained closed. Angela squeezed it gently, grounding herself in the warmth of his fingers. "Would you like another drink, Miss Carter?" The voice startled her. Rachel stood at her side, a soft smile that couldn't quite conceal the apology layered beneath it. Angela glanced at David's cup half full and shook her head. "No, thank you," she replied, offering Rachel a knowing look. Rachel lingered for a second longer, as if searching for something to say, then gave a small nod and moved down the aisle. Angela watched her go, recognizing the quiet guilt pressing against Rachel's shoulders. That was the thing about people like Rachel. They felt the weight of moments like these but feared carrying too much of it. Angela didn't resent her for it. But sympathy does not ease the sharp edges of injustice. As Rachel disappeared toward the back of the plane, Veronica's voice rang out again, this time louder, though she wasn't speaking to Angela. "Let's make sure all personal items remain secured until we begin descent." Veronica called down the aisle, her eyes sweeping over Angela's row with the precision of a blade. Angela did not move, but her heart tightened. Marcus shifted again, his attention narrowing in on Veronica. His lips pressed into a thin line. Angela knew that look, the way a man prepares himself to stand not out of obligation, but because something within him can no longer remain seated. But still, she waited. The minutes stretched, heavy and suffocating, until the captain's voice broke through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Atlanta. Please make sure your seat belts are fastened." Angela's hand instinctively moved to secure David's belt, her fingers grazing his arm as he yawned softly and sat up. "Are we almost there?" David asked, rubbing his eyes. "Yes, baby," she whispered, but her voice felt distant, as though she were answering him from another room. David glanced around, his attention drifting lazily across the cabin, blissfully unaware of the tension his mother had wrapped herself in like armor. Marcus leaned toward Angela, his voice low but firm. "If she says one more thing," he murmured, "I'm stepping in." Angela met his eyes, searching for something in them. She saw it, the resolve, the certainty that he had seen enough. Angela nodded, but part of her already knew this was far from over. The plane tilted slightly as the descent continued, but Veronica's gaze lingered, her eyes cutting back toward Angela's row with a quiet persistence that refused to relent. Angela braced herself, waiting for the next flicker of authority to land squarely on her shoulders. It didn't take long. Veronica approached under the guise of checking seatbelts, her fingers brushing unnecessarily over the tops of headrests as she moved down the aisle. And then, "Ms. Carter, can I ask you to adjust your son's tray table for landing?" Angela blinked, turning toward David's seat. The tray was already up. "It's secured," Angela replied, her voice calm but tight. Veronica paused, her hand hovering over the back of the seat in front of David, her expression unreadable. "I just wanted to be sure," Veronica said, but her tone betrayed the lie beneath it. Marcus's voice cut through the space like a cold wind. "It's secure," he repeated, louder this time. Angela looked at him, feeling the temperature in the cabin shift. Veronica hesitated, but Marcus's gaze pinned her in place. Passengers around them stirred, the quiet hum of whispered conversations picking up as more eyes settled on the exchange. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom once more, reminding everyone to remain seated for the final descent. Veronica straightened, but not before Angela saw the flicker of something raw in her eyes. Frustration, yes, but also fear, the realization that she had lost control of whatever story she had been trying to tell herself. Marcus did not sit back immediately. He remained upright until Veronica retreated toward the galley, her steps quicker, more uncertain. Angela exhaled, reaching for David's hand once more. "You okay, Mama?" David asked quietly, tilting his head toward her. Angela smiled, brushing her thumb over his knuckles. "I'm fine, baby," she whispered, but Marcus's eyes told her what they both knew to be true. The plane may have been landing, but the ground beneath them was still shaking. The wheels had not yet kissed the ground, but Angela could already feel the landing. It was not the soft, Predictable descent the captain had promised over the intercom. No, this landing began long before the plane's nose tilted toward the runway. It began with the narrowing of Veronica's eyes, the cold stiffness of her spine, the weight of Marcus Reed's gaze as he lingered, standing when the rest of the world sat. Angela knew this flight would follow her long after they touched the tarmac. David pressed his face to the window, the city below unfolding like an unmarked canvas, full of lights that blurred against the setting sun. His excitement had returned, but Angela's stomach remained knotted, pulled tighter with each passing minute. She should have been able to enjoy this, the simple joy of arriving somewhere new. Somewhere she had planned for months. But prejudice has a way of packing itself in your luggage, following you like a shadow that no amount of distance can outrun. Veronica hovered near the galley, her movements stiff and robotic. Angela could see her from the corner of her eye, arranging items that had long been secured. Her hands trembled faintly, but not with fear, no. This was something else. This was the frustration of a woman forced to step back. And Angela knew women like Veronica didn't stay quiet for long. The plane sank lower, the pressure building in Angela's ears. But there was no relief in swallowing. The tightness in her chest remained, anchored to her ribs. Marcus had not sat down. He stood at the edge of first class, one hand resting lightly on the seat in front of him. His posture was calm, but Angela recognized the readiness in his stance, the coiled restraint of a man too accustomed to witnessing the same story play out over and over again. Veronica glanced up, her eyes meeting his for only a breath before she looked away. Angela felt David shift beside her, his fingers intertwining with hers as the plane banked slightly to the right. "How much longer?" he whispered. "Almost there," she replied softly, smoothing her palm over his curls. But she wasn't certain who she was trying to comfort, her son or herself. It should have ended there. It could have ended with descent, with the wheels finding solid ground and passengers gathering their belongings, eager to press forward into the next part of their journey. But prejudice rarely exits quietly. The plane jolted gently as the landing gear locked into place, and Angela breathed deeply, counting the seconds until they were firmly on the ground. And then, a voice. "Excuse me, sir." Veronica's voice rang out, tight as piano wire. Angela's eyes snapped toward the front of the plane. Veronica was no longer by the galley. She had stepped forward, standing just 2 rows away from Marcus. "Sir, you need to take your seat," Veronica said, her hand resting on the back of a chair, her knuckles white. Marcus turned slowly, the shift in his expression so subtle it could have been missed by anyone not paying attention. But Angela saw it. So did Veronica. "I'll sit when we land," Marcus replied evenly. His voice was not loud, but it carried. Passengers began to lift their heads, eyes flickering toward the confrontation as whispers bloomed in pockets across the cabin. Angela's heart pounded. "Sir, it's standard policy." "I am familiar with the policy," Marcus interrupted, his tone sharp enough to silence the rows nearest them. "I also know the plane is less than 5 minutes from the ground." Angela felt the heat rising. This was the moment the gust of wind that reignites embers left smoldering. She watched Veronica's lips press into a thin line, her shoulders squared as if bracing herself. Angela had seen this kind of power struggle before, masked behind uniforms and rules that twisted in the hands of those determined to wield them. Veronica didn't need Marcus to sit. She needed to win. Angela tightened her grip on David's hand, willing herself to stay seated, to stay calm. But staying calm had never stopped the slow burn of injustice. Veronica stepped closer to Marcus, lowering her voice, though it still carried. "You're making other passengers uncomfortable." Angela's breath caught in her throat. There it was, the oldest weapon, the invocation of fear, not of the one creating the problem, but the one calling attention to it. Angela's muscles tensed. Marcus smiled faintly, though his eyes remained cold. "I think the only person uncomfortable right now is you." The air in the cabin seemed to vanish, replaced by something Angela couldn't name, something heavy and sharp that cut at the edges of everyone's silence. Angela heard it before she saw it. A voice. An older man in the next row spoke up, his face partially obscured by the brim of his hat. "He's not bothering anyone," the man said plainly. Another voice followed, this time from a woman across the aisle. "He's right, leave him be." Angela's heart raced as the quiet resistance spread. Small but unmistakable. Veronica's eyes darted nervously toward the cockpit. But the captain had not intervened. Marcus did not move. And neither did Angela. The wheels finally touched down, the plane's body sinking into the runway with a soft thud. Angela exhaled, feeling David press closer to her side. Passengers stirred, reaching for bags and jackets. But Angela stayed seated, her gaze locked on Veronica, who now stood frozen at the front of the plane. The captain's voice returned over the intercom, thanking passengers for their flight. But Veronica did not speak again. Marcus finally eased into his seat as the plane taxied. But his presence filled the space long after he sat. Angela met his eyes across the aisle. And for the first time since the flight began, she allowed herself to smile. It was small, but it was victory enough. The plane slowed as it taxied. But inside, the cabin felt anything but still. Angela could hear the shift in the air and unspoken tension that stretched between passengers and crew, settling over them like fog. David stirred beside her, rubbing his eyes as the jolt of landing nudged him from sleep. "We here?" he asked, his voice soft and thick with drowsiness. Angela smoothed his hair, brushing crumbs of rest from his face. "We're here, baby," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if the words were meant for him or herself. Veronica had retreated toward the galley. Though she carried the weight of the encounter with her, Angela could feel it, the quiet but simmering heat of a woman who had been denied the final word. And Marcus Reed, seated only a few rows ahead, remained upright, his gaze fixed forward but distant. The wheels of the plane crept along the tarmac. But the real descent was still happening within the cabin. Within, the people seated in uneasy silence. Angela glanced around, noting the passengers who had spoken up. The older man, his hat still tilted low over his brow, now gazed out the window as if nothing had happened. The woman who had echoed him sat back with her arms crossed, tapping her fingers absently against her sleeve. The small rebellion had dissipated into quiet. But quiet does not mean forgotten. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice returned over the intercom, smooth and detached, "we've arrived at our gate. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off." The bell chimed, and Angela unbuckled David's belt carefully, her hands steady but her chest still tight. She kept waiting for something, an apology, a word, or even a glance from Veronica. But none came. Because that's how it is, Angela thought. Sometimes the people who need to speak the most are the first to disappear. David yawned beside her, kicking his feet lightly against the edge of the seat. "Can we go now?" he asked. "Not yet," Angela said, glancing toward the aisle where Veronica stood by the exit, her posture stiff as passengers began to gather their belongings. Marcus stood as well, retrieving his briefcase from the overhead compartment with unhurried precision. Angela felt the weight of the next few moments long before they unfolded. She eased David's jacket over his shoulders, smoothing the fabric down as he adjusted his bag. "Stay close," she whispered, even though he always did. The line of passengers shuffled forward. But Angela waited, her seatbelt still buckled even as those around her began to leave. Marcus lingered, his steps measured as he approached the exit where Veronica waited. And then, just as Marcus reached her, she spoke. "Thank you for flying with us, sir," Veronica said, the words clipped, forced. Marcus paused, turning to her with the calm, unwavering patience of a man who knew how to let silence do the talking. "Ms. Veronica," he began softly, his voice barely rising above the soft hum of the engine, "I trust you'll reconsider how you treat your passengers in the future." Angela felt the weight in his words, each syllable folding over itself with quiet authority. Veronica's expression barely shifted, but Angela saw it, the small crack behind her eyes, the brief flicker of discomfort she fought to conceal. Marcus's gaze did not linger. He offered her a slight nod, and then he stepped off the plane without another word. Angela rose, guiding David forward. As they approached Veronica, Angela met her eyes not with anger, but with certainty. Angela had lived too long and fought too many quiet wars to let this moment pass unnoticed. She did not speak. She did not need to. But as Angela stepped onto the jet bridge, feeling the weight of the ground beneath her feet, she whispered to David, "You did good today." David blinked up at her, confusion flickering across his young face. "I didn't do anything," he said softly. Angela smiled, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "Yes, you did," she replied, Sometimes survival itself is resistance. Marcus waited just outside the gate, his back to the terminal windows, watching the sun slip below the horizon. Angela stopped beside him, shifting David's bag higher onto her shoulder. "Thank you," she said quietly. Marcus nodded, his eyes still distant. "It's not about thanks," he replied, glancing down at David, who now marveled at the size of the planes outside. "It's about making sure he doesn't grow up thinking this is normal." Angela swallowed, feeling the truth of his words settle deep in her bones. For a moment, the three of them stood there, a shared understanding passing between them. And then, like Marcus, Angela stepped forward out into the world that awaited her, where battles like these were far from over. But she would fight them. Not because she wanted to, but because she had to. And because David was watching. The airport terminal buzzed around them, the steady hum of voices and rolling suitcases merging into a distant drone. David clung to Angela's hand, his eyes bright as he watched planes through the wide glass windows. The weight of the flight still lingered, like a bruise that hadn't quite surfaced. Angela felt it in the way Marcus Reed walked ahead of them. His shoulders squared but his steps slow. It was the weight of a man too familiar with battles fought in silence, fights that left no visible scars. Only a quiet exhaustion that settled deep into the bones. Angela's grip on David's hand tightened as they neared the baggage claim. It should have ended there. They should have collected their bags, disappeared into the crowd, and let the memory of Veronica and her sharp gaze fade into the blur of the day. But the world doesn't always let you walk away so easily. Angela saw her first. Veronica. She stood near the customer service counter, speaking quietly to another flight attendant. Angela noted the stiff set of her shoulders, the way her eyes flicked toward the stream of disembarking passengers without lingering too long. Veronica's gaze found Angela's in the crowd, locking for the briefest moment. Angela felt David tug at her hand. "Can I get a snack?" he asked, glancing toward a vending machine nearby. Angela smiled softly, brushing his hair back. "Go ahead, baby. I'll watch from here." David skipped off, his small figure cutting through the crowd. Angela's eyes returned to Veronica. Marcus caught it. He followed Angela's line of sight, then stopped beside her, crossing his arms over his chest. "You don't have to say anything," Marcus murmured. Angela exhaled slowly. "No," she replied, "but maybe she does." Marcus didn't argue. He understood the weight of words left unspoken and how they could grow heavier if not released. Angela approached with measured steps, watching as Veronica stiffened. The attendant beside her whispered something and walked away, leaving the two women standing alone. Veronica lifted her chin, as if bracing for something. Angela stood before her, calm and unshaken. "I want you to understand something," Angela said quietly, her voice steady but heavy with the force of everything she had held back. Veronica's eyes narrowed, but she did not speak. Angela leaned in slightly, her words low but sharp enough to cut through the space between them. "My son," she began, each word deliberate, "will remember the way you looked at him. He'll remember the sound of your voice when you told him to sit up. As if you were doing something wrong just by being a child." Veronica's lips parted, but Angela pressed on. "He'll remember the tension in the air. And years from now, when he's old enough to understand it, he'll know exactly what it was." Angela let the words settle, watching the flicker of unease in Veronica's face. Veronica shifted her weight, crossing her arms, but there was no confidence in the gesture. "I was doing my job," Veronica muttered, though the words held little conviction. Angela smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. "You weren't doing your job," she replied. "You were doing what this world taught you to do. And maybe you thought no one would notice." Angela stepped back slightly, glancing toward David, who stood by the vending machine, inspecting his snack with the careful curiosity of a child who still believed the world was kind. "But I noticed," Angela continued, her voice softening, but not enough to dull its edge. "And one day, you'll have to answer for that." Veronica's eyes faltered, drifting down to the floor. Marcus, still standing a few feet away, met Angela's gaze as she turned back toward him. "It doesn't always change anything," Marcus said quietly as Angela returned to David's side. Angela watched as David trotted back, grinning as he tore open the bag of crackers he'd selected. "No," she replied, lifting David's jacket over his shoulders. "But sometimes, saying it out loud is the only thing that lets you keep moving forward." Marcus nodded faintly, as if to say he understood. David tugged at Angela's sleeve. Can we go now? Angela smiled down at him, brushing her thumb gently across his cheek. Yes, baby, she whispered. We can go. As they walked toward the exit, Angela didn't look back, but she knew Veronica was still standing there, still feeling the weight of being seen. The airport terminal stretched out before Angela like an open road she wasn't entirely sure how to walk. David held her hand, swinging his legs forward with the lightness only children seem to possess. His world, for now, was filled with the crinkle of a snack bag and the promise of whatever lay beyond the glass doors ahead. Angela wanted to step into that world with him, to lose herself in the hum of travel, in the ordinariness of arrival. But the weight of what had happened on that plane hadn't loosened its grip. It sat heavy in the pit of her stomach, coiling there like a warning. Marcus Reed walked just behind them, a quiet sentinel. He hadn't asked if she was all right. He didn't need to. The question was too small, too fragile for the moment. Angela slowed as they neared the baggage claim, watching the carousel lurch to life with a metallic groan. Suitcases tumbled onto the conveyor belt, colliding with one another in a rush toward their waiting hands. David tugged at her sleeve. Is our bag here yet? Not yet, baby, Angela replied softly, scanning the luggage. Marcus stepped beside her, his voice low. She's still watching. Angela didn't need to ask who. She could feel it, the sharp edge of Veronica's gaze lingering somewhere behind her. Angela didn't turn around. I know, she said, lifting David onto the bench beside her so his legs could dangle freely. Marcus shifted, slipping his hands into his pockets. She's waiting for something, he muttered, his eyes scanning the crowd. Angela exhaled. She's waiting for me to make a mistake. Angela said, that's how this works. They push until you push back, then they say you're the problem. Marcus nodded, his eyes darkening. That's the trap, he replied. Angela's chest tightened, though she smiled as David pointed excitedly at a blue suitcase sliding down the belt. Is that ours? David asked. Angela shook her head. Not yet, she whispered. But it wasn't the luggage she was thinking about. She glanced at Marcus, her voice quiet but firm. And what happens if you don't push back? Marcus's gaze met hers. Then they keep pushing, he said. Angela swallowed hard, her hand resting protectively on David's back as he kicked his legs against the bench. She wanted to believe there was another way, a path that didn't end with someone like Veronica standing just far enough away to be untouchable. But Angela knew better. You could carry all the patience in the world, but there comes a time when silence feels like surrender. And Angela was tired of surrendering. A voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the arrival of more luggage. Angela watched the crowd swell, travelers stepping forward with eager hands, claiming what belonged to them. David yawned beside her, resting his head against her arm. Angela brushed his hair back, glancing once more toward Marcus. She'll follow me out if I don't say something, Angela murmured. Marcus's eyes narrowed, scanning the terminal behind them. She might. Angela nodded, exhaling slowly. I'm not going to let her, she said, lifting David from the bench. Marcus's brow lifted, but he said nothing, letting Angela lead the way. As they stepped toward the exit, Angela finally allowed herself to look back. Veronica stood near the gate, arms crossed, her face half shadowed beneath the fluorescent lights. Angela held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, not with defiance but with the quiet force of someone who refused to disappear. Veronica's expression didn't shift, but Angela knew what she saw: a woman still standing. She tightened her grip on David's hand and stepped through the glass doors. Feeling the cool rush of air hit her face, Marcus followed at a distance, his footsteps steady behind them. And somewhere behind him, Veronica remained a shadow, shrinking beneath the weight of a moment she could no longer control. The sliding doors parted with a hush, and the airport gave way to the cool night air. Angela stepped forward, David's hand snug in hers, feeling the tension of the terminal peel away slow, reluctant, like skin lifting from a wound. But wounds don't simply vanish when you leave the room where they were inflicted. Angela glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see Veronica standing there, watching, but the terminal behind her shimmered with distant figures, none of them familiar. Veronica had disappeared into the machine she served, blending back into its steel and glass framework. Angela knew better than to feel relief. Marcus Reed walked a few steps behind, his presence as steady as it had been since the moment he'd risen from his seat. There was nothing performative about it, no grand gesture, no spoken alliance. It was the quiet solidarity of a man who knew the fight wasn't over, even when the battle had ended. David tugged at Angela's sleeve. "Can we get ice cream now?" he asked, his voice bright with the innocence only children possess after long flights and tired mothers. Angela smiled, the weight in her chest softening. "Yes, baby," she whispered. "Ice cream sounds perfect." But as they crossed the pavement toward the rideshare line, Angela saw the reflection of a uniform in the glass of the airport window. Her breath caught, but she didn't stop walking. It wasn't Veronica. A different flight attendant stood near the curb, leaning into conversation with a driver. Angela let out a slow exhale, though she felt foolish for the tightness in her throat. The thing about racism, the kind that slides into moments like the whisper of a knife, is that it teaches you to look over your shoulder even when there's no one there. Angela had lived long enough to know it isn't paranoia. It's preparation. Marcus caught up to them as they reached the waiting area. "Where are you headed?" he asked, his voice light but filled with the undertone of someone who wasn't quite ready to part ways. Angela gave him a soft glance, recognizing the question for what it was, a hand still extended, even after the danger seemed to pass. "Downtown," she replied. Marcus nodded. "Same direction. I'll ride with you, if you don't mind." Angela hesitated for a beat, then nodded. Sometimes you don't realize how much you needed company until someone offers to stay. The car pulled up moments later, the headlights cutting a soft path through the dark. Marcus opened the door, letting Angela and David slide in first before settling into the seat beside them. David pressed his face to the window, his breath fogging the glass. Angela rested her head against the seat, closing her eyes for the first time since the plane had taken off. The car rumbled forward, and for a while, no one spoke. But silence isn't always empty. Angela could feel Marcus's presence beside her, heavy with the kind of weight only experience can carry. He finally broke the quiet. "Do you think she'll remember this?" Marcus asked, his voice low, almost to himself. Angela opened her eyes, watching the city lights flicker past. "Veronica?" Angela replied, shifting slightly in her seat. Marcus nodded. Angela considered the question carefully. "She'll remember," Angela said softly, "but not for the reasons you think." Marcus glanced at her, waiting. Angela continued, her voice steady. "She won't remember David or me. She'll remember how it felt to lose control. How you and those passengers saw her for what she was in that moment. That's what lingers, the embarrassment." Marcus exhaled, nodding faintly. "You're right," he said. Angela glanced at David, whose eyelids had grown heavy once more. "But I don't need her to remember me," Angela added. "I just need David to remember that I didn't stay quiet." Marcus's gaze softened, and for the first time that evening, a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "He will," Marcus said, "and that's what matters." The city came into view, the glow of downtown spilling onto the horizon. The car slowed as they approached Angela's stop. Marcus stepped out first, holding the door as Angela lifted David into her arms. As she turned toward the building, Marcus spoke again. "You ever need anything?" he said quietly, handing her a business card with nothing but his name and number. Angela hesitated but took it, folding it neatly into her pocket. "I appreciate that," she replied. Marcus nodded, tipping his head slightly. "Take care of him," he said, looking at David. Angela smiled. "I always do," as she carried David inside, the door clicking softly behind her. Angela let herself breathe deeply for the first time that day. The world outside hadn't changed. The rules had not shifted. But she had spoken. And sometimes, that was enough to hold onto for another day.